The presentation of anarchism as social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race. The emancipation.
Anarchist Essays is brought to you by Loughborough University's Anarchism Research Group. For more information on the ARG, see the link in the show notes or follow us on Twitter at ARGLBORO. The Embryonic Abolitionist Ideas of William Godwin in the Late 18th Century by Ruby Tuke. Let's begin in the 1790s, a decade of revolution, political panic, and intense debate about the future of society. Across Europe, the shockwaves of the French Revolution were still reverberating. In Britain, the government feared that revolutionary ideas might cross the Channel and spark unrest at home. Radical societies were surveyed, reformers prosecuted, and political dissent treated with deep suspicion. And in the middle of this tense and uncertain moment stood the political philosopher and novelist William Godwin. Godwin believed something extraordinarily radical for his time, that human beings, guided by reason and moral reflection, could organise their lives without government, coercive authority, or punitive institutions. Today, Godwin is often remembered as a proto-anarchist, an early critic of the modern state and a key figure in the history of anarchist political thought. But one important, related dimension of his work has received far less attention: the extent to which his ideas anticipate the principles of modern penal abolitionism. By penal abolition, I mean the heterogeneous intellectual and political movement that argues the penal system itself, prisons, policing, and punitive law, does more harm than good. Rather than reforming prisons, abolitionists call for community-based, non-coercive responses to harm and for transforming the social conditions that make punishment appear necessary. In this episode of Anarchist Essays, I explore why Godwin belongs in that history. We'll examine his claim that criminals are not born but made, see how his fiction exposes the violence of the legal system, and consider his fierce rejection of prisons as sites of moral reform, ideas that anticipate the abolitionist movements of today. To understand the abolitionist implications of Godwin's work, we need to begin with his theory of human nature. In an inquiry concerning political justice, published in 1793, the political philosopher makes a deceptively simple claim. Human beings are not born morally fixed. They enter the world with no innate principles, neither virtuous nor vicious. This was a radical assertion in the 1790s. If people are not born criminals, then criminality cannot be an intrinsic feature of individuals. Instead, it must emerge from the social environments in which people live. Human behaviour, in other words, is shaped, not predetermined. Godwin repeatedly identifies one structural cause of harmful behaviour in particular: the inequalities generated by private property. In Political Justice, he argues that the original sin of the worst men lies not primarily in their character, but in the perverseness of institutions that do not fulfil our human needs. The implication is profound. Crime in this framework is not simply an individual moral failure. It is a social phenomenon generated by unjust institutions. Once that premise is accepted, the moral logic of punishment begins to unravel. Punishment assumes that individuals are solely responsible for actions whose actual causes lie in the organisation of society itself. Godwin's insight closely anticipates later abolitionist thinkers such as Luke Holzman, who famously argued that crime has no ontological reality. It is not a single objective category, but a label applied to a wide variety of human conflicts. Godwin makes essentially the same point almost 2 centuries earlier. He observes that the law groups radically different acts under the same category of murder: killing in self-defense, killing to prevent sexual violence, killing out of jealousy. Yet the moral meaning of each act differs enormously. No single punishment, he argues, can possibly capture that complexity. The legal system simplifies human actions into rigid categories and assigns predetermined penalties. For Godwin, this reduction is not merely crude, it is unjust. Godwin did not confine this critique to abstract philosophy. He also explored it through fiction. His 1794 novel, Things as They Are, or The Adventures of Caleb Williams, transforms the theoretical arguments of political justice into narrative form. If political justice provides the theory, Caleb Williams relays the horrifying experience. The story follows Caleb, a young servant who uncovers a terrible secret about his aristocratic employer, Mr. Falkland. Falkland has murdered a rival, but 2 innocent men, the Hawkins father and son, are accused and executed for the crime. Across his novels, prisons, prisoners and punitive institutions appear again and again. As Colleen Fenno observes, these recurring scenes constantly undercut the fiction of a just criminal justice system or a stable definition of crime. One episode in Caleb Williams involving the Hawkins family reveals the logic of the system with brutal clarity. Their landlord Tyrrell destroys their livelihood out of spite. He floods their land, blocks access to their farm, and uses the law as a weapon against them. All of this behaviour is perfectly legal. But when the younger Hawkins attempts to remove the obstruction blocking his own land, he is prosecuted. The message is unmistakable. The law punishes the poor for survival while protecting the powerful as they inflict harm. Godwin extends this critique to the courtroom itself. In Caleb Williams, trials are not spaces where truth is discovered. They are theatres of reputation, class prejudice, and narrative manipulation. Witnesses claim to recognise the Hawkins men largely because they expect criminals to look poor. Falkland, by contrast, is presumed innocent because he is a gentleman. Godwin had already warned in Political Justice that witnesses are often ignorant and prejudiced, and that true impartiality is impossible. The novel demonstrates exactly what this means. The innocent die, the guilty remain free, and the legal system legitimises the outcome. Even when, in the published version of the ending, the truth emerges, the law proves incapable of delivering justice. As John Mee observes, the novel's final encounter with the law provides only testimony to its inadequacy as a tribunal to judge personal relations. The law can produce verdicts, but it cannot resolve the deeper moral realities of human conflict. Godwin's critique extends further to the institution that would soon dominate modern punishment, the prison. During the late 18th century, imprisonment was becoming the central form of criminal punishment in Britain. Reformers such as John Howard advocated cleaner prisons and stricter discipline, believing that isolation and order would encourage moral reform. Godwin rejected this optimism. In Political Justice, he writes that jails are to a proverb seminaries of vice. Prisons, he argues, do not rehabilitate offenders. Instead, they intensify the very behaviours they claim to correct. Individuals accused of very different offences are confined together and forced to construct what social order they can within the prison environment. The result is moral deterioration rather than improvement. Solitary confinement, in Godwin's view, is even worse. Some 18th century reformers believed that isolation would encourage moral reflection. Godwin instead described solitary confinement as one of the harshest torments human beings could experience. Humans are social creatures. Moral development occurs through interaction, conversation, and shared experience. Isolation removes the very conditions required for moral growth. The psychological reality of imprisonment appears vividly in Caleb Williams. Caleb describes the silent, intolerable minutes of confinement, a form of suffering that feels worse than physical torture. Time itself becomes oppressive. More than a century later, the work of Henri Lefebvre would be used by penologists to describe this phenomenon as prison time, a distorted and heightened consciousness of duration produced by confinement. The penal abolitionist scholar David Gordon Scott, drawing on Henri Lefebvre and Roger Matthews, calls this an increased sense of time consciousness. Godwin captured the psychological reality of this experience long before it had a name. Equally important is his analysis of prison authority. Godwin does not portray abusive guards as isolated individuals. Instead, he suggests that the institutional structure of prisons itself produces cruelty. Guards exercise near absolute authority over people whose social standing has already been stripped away. Prisoners may be mocked, neglected, or brutalised, but there's little they can do. Godwin poses a simple but devastating question. When abuse occurs inside the prison, to whom shall the unfortunate felon appeal? These institutional criticisms lead Godwin to a much more radical conclusion. He rejects punishment itself. Godwin's ethical reasoning is straightforward. He writes that whatever is not attended with any beneficial purpose is not just. Punishment, in his view, rarely produces genuine benefit. But his deeper objection concerns how punishment treats the person being punished. When someone is punished as an example to others, Godwin argues, society treats them with supercilious neglect as if they were totally incapable of feeling and morality. The offender becomes an instrument, a warning designed to frighten others. For Godwin, this is morally indefensible. Punishment denies the very human capacities it claims to defend: reason, moral reflection, and the potential for improvement. He also challenges the logic of deterrence itself. People commit harmful acts partly because they believe they will escape detection. If they knew their actions would be judged by a community whose respect they valued, the psychological calculus would change. He offers a striking analogy. Expecting someone to commit harm when they know their community will confront them, he says, would be as irrational as expecting a person to willfully break his leg for the sake of being cured by a skilled surgeon. Punishment, therefore, fails on two levels. It denies the humanity of the person being punished, and it fails to achieve its own stated purpose. Godwin was not naive about human conflict. He recognised that people harm one another. What he rejected was the assumption that coercive punishment is the appropriate response. For Godwin, the abolition of prisons forms part of a broader social transformation, grounded in what he called perfectibility, the idea that people can improve morally through reason, education, and cooperation. Rather than relying on coercive institutions, he envisioned forms of accountability rooted in community relationships. Human beings care deeply about the judgment of those whose respect they value. Social recognition, not fear, becomes the primary mechanism of moral regulation. Godwin describes this as a system grounded in general justice and mutual interest, which bind people together more effectively than signatures and seals. When harm occurs, the focus should shift away from punishment and towards understanding the context of the action, repairing relationships, and preventing future harm. These principles closely resemble contemporary restorative and transformative justice practices. The terminology did not exist in Godwin's time, of course, but the ethical framework was already there. Critics in Godwin's own era raised a familiar objection. Even if his ideas were morally appealing, society was not ready for such radical change. Godwin refused to accept that argument. Once people recognise injustice, he writes, once they become convinced of the flagrant absurdity of an institution, they are prepared to supersede it. Abolition, in other words, is not a distant utopian endpoint. It is a reflective process. William Godwin lived in a world shaped by revolution, repression, and profound uncertainty. But his response to that world was not fear. It was philosophical ambition. He believed that human beings are shaped by their social environments, that they are capable of moral development, and that institutions built on coercion undermine the very virtues they claim to defend. Prisons, in his view, were not evidence that punishment was necessary. They were evidence that society had organised itself badly. More than 2 centuries later, abolitionists continue to ask the same questions. Why harm occurs, how communities should respond to it, and whether justice can exist within institutions built on punishment. Godwin's work reminds us that these debates have a long intellectual history. The idea that society should respond to harm without prisons is not new. It has been imagined before. And if Godwin is right, if human beings are capable of moral growth under the right conditions, then we should not fixate on whether another system is imaginable. The fact that we are now seriously questioning these institutions may itself be a sign that change is already underway.
Thank you for listening. To help others find anarchist essays, please rate and review us wherever you find your podcasts. And if you're interested in anarchist ideas, why not check out the journal Anarchist Studies? For over 20 years, Anarchist Studies has been publishing original research on the history, theory, and practice of anarchism. For more information, visit www.lwbooks.co.uk/anarchist-studies.